Right, okay, guys, listen, welcome to another Blimey. And I'm delighted to have Mr. Richard. Now, hopefully, I get your surname right here, Richard Leinfellner. How was that out,
Perfect.
Mark? Was that a 10 out of 10, was it?
10 out of 10, yeah. Very good.
What nationality is that? I'm detecting is that a bit of German coming across in
Yeah,
your
yeah.
accent?
I'm Austrian. I'm from Vienna originally. I came to the
Austrian.
UK.
Right, right.
In 1974. And I came to UK when they had 1974 heat wave. So I thought that the UK was a tropical country. How wrong could I have been?
You'll be absolutely bloody gutted then coming up here. Trust me, don't come to Scotland. If you don't like the rain, don't come to Scotland.
Oh, I've been many of times, and I'm familiar with the rain.
Oh, yeah, fantastic. So, listen, Richard, the question I always like to ask all my kind of guests is, when did you first become aware of computers, video games, computer games, arcade games? When did you first become aware of these things?
Quite a long time ago. I went to school in Hounslow, which is just a suburb of London, and we had one of the first computers at school, research machines 380Z, and I kind of made it mine basically, and I helped them set it up, and me and my friend, we kind of looked after it, and we started programming it, and the first thing of course we do is write some games for it, and it's all done in BASIC then, and then my sister really liked Space Invaders, so I promised her I would make her a Space Invaders game if she lent me the money to buy Microtran 65 kit computer, which I did, and with her money, and I paid her back, of course, but I also did Space Invaders for her on that.
Wow.
And so we did that all in assembly language 6502. And then, but the real break, this is just kind of a hobby. And then while sort of my best friend at school, a guy called Suresh Patel, he was going back to see his family in India, and he had a Saturday job at the Video Palace in London, in Kensington. And he knew I was going to university, so he said to me, "Can I look after his Saturday job?" Because he didn't want somebody in his job that would stay after he gets back. He wanted his job back, basically.
Yeah.
So he thought I was a relatively safe bet because I knew computers and I knew the technology, but also I was going to university, so I wouldn't be hanging about when he wants his job back. So I interviewed for the job, got the job, and we started. That shop sold computers and sold, early Commodore VIC-20s then actually, Atari 400s. We sold consoles, we sold video machines and satellite dishes. It was a spin-off by the people who'd left Virgin, and the guy called Nick Powell had left Virgin and split with Branson, and he set up a video shop. He wasn't allowed to do music anymore after leaving Virgin, so he set up a video shop.
Was that like a franchise, or was it like a one-off shop?
It was a one-off shop, and Nick was the guy who brought Evil Dead to the UK, and Nick did a lot of. He died recently, very sadly. But he did a lot of really innovative things, and one of them was actually he realized the power of computers and home computers, and so he started selling them, and then one day I realized we're selling a lot of software. At that point, Llamasoft was really big, and actually Jeff Minter's mum used to come in with the boxes of cassettes, and used to bring them in, and we used to give her cash for them. And I said to my boss, a guy called Pete Stone, and Pete was also at Virgin before. I said to him, we should consider making video games. He said, I said to him, we've got all these film licenses through the film part of Palace Video. We should maybe make video games. And he sort of said to me, well, do you know how to make video games? And no, it can't be that difficult. So I taught myself how to program the Commodore 64, and we put out our first game. that's how Palace Software was born. It was simply those days. Nick Powell backed us, and Palace backed us, and we started Palace Software. And we moved to just above the Scala Cinema in King's Cross, which was also owned by, that room was owned by Palace. It's where they stored all of their video masters. So we had very cheap accommodation, and we started making games. The first game I made was actually Evil Dead for the Commodore 64.
So this shop that you worked at, how were they affiliated to Palace Software? And you're saying that they had all the licenses. How did that?
It was Palace Group, and Palace Group was Palace Video, the Video Palace. So Video Palace was the shop. Palace Video was essentially the people who make videos. There was Palace Films who made films later on. Absolutely, you might have heard of Absolute Beginners and Lisa. So they made those films.
David Bowie, yeah.
Yeah, so they made a bunch of films. So Palace Group was basically, imagine like a video version of Virgin. So it's kind of that's what Nick modeled it on basically. And they essentially gave us the money to spin up Palace Software. So we were owned by Palace Group. So it's always basically the same company at the top level.
Right. Yeah.
But because we had access to because Nick had access to the movies, at that point, video game rights were really easy. You know, nobody knew what they were worth. So a lot of times we got them for free, really. So you know, Sam Raimi just gave us the rights to make Evil Dead, the game. I don't think we paid him anything.
So I mean, so was it your idea? Obviously, you know, Palace had quite a few films. Was it your idea? You thought, oh, I'll have a crack at Evil Dead, and was that because you were a big fan of the film?
Oh, I hate horror movies.
Do you really?
Yeah, I literally was watching the horror movie behind my hands. You know, I'm not a horror fan at all. But the film was very popular, and we needed something that would turn into an action game. You know, and if you think about making a game, you know, if you have like a, you know, I was going to say one of the films that Palace distributed was Taxi zum Klo, which was a sort of a German gay porno movie. You can't make a game out of that. You know, you have to pick something up that's that where there's actions. You know, so you need actions. So we used to, you know, action verbs, like, you know, and of course horror movies are brilliant because it's slashing, hacking, running, anything ending in ing. You know, you can make an action of in a game. So you need to have the right property to do this with. But then also I realized that actually making that, you know, the license is also very constraining, because at that point it's also people started realizing those licenses are worth a lot of money, and there's lots of companies making licensed games. So we sort of fairly quickly went on to, you know, we did Evil Dead and pretty much did everything. Pete did the art and I did all coding, and then that was a fairly mediocre success. But it gave the company enough confidence to proceed with the next game. So at that point, we thought, well, we should really hire an artist. So we hired a guy called Steve Brown, and basically, you know, Steve was like our first artist. He thought he was coming for a job designing covers for a video magazine. So he had a really strange first day when he realized he was actually making video games. So we started doing this, and to be honest, at that point we just thought, well, what do we do? And we thought, well, the licensing thing, it's okay, but the licenses we want, Palace hasn't got. So we wanted to make fighting games. Fighting games were really big then, you know, things like Yeehaw Kung Fu and stuff like that. So we wanted to make a fighting game.
Yeah.
So Steve had just seen Conan the Barbarian. So we thought, why don't we make a game that's inspired, in inverted commas, by Conan? And you know, sort of, and we sort of started looking at that. But actually, even before that, we made a game called Cauldron, which was before Barbarian. We did a game called Cauldron, which again, that sort of came out of we wanted to make a platform game, but we also wanted to make a side-scrolling game because we liked both genres. So those days it was really easy. We just decided we wanted to do it, and we did it. You know. So with Cauldron, it's basically nobody had ever done a side-scrolling game that also had platform in it. So Steve and I were down the pub quite frequently, and we're just discussing, you know, why has nobody ever done this? And Steve said, well, is there a technical issue with making a scrolling versus a platform? I said, no, you can do both in the same game. So we came up with Cauldron. So again, that was inspired by. He had he had a lot of sort of good artwork. Steve was very good. He still is a very good artist. So it started with his art, basically.
I mean, I want to go back to Evil Dead in a second, but yeah, I mean, Cauldron is, I've put in here, it's probably, I mean, I got my first Commodore 64 back in 1983, so I'm real old school, so I remember games before Turbo Load came along, when it literally did take 10 minutes to load a game. But I think, suffice to say, Cauldron is one of the best looking and probably sounding Commodore 64 games. It really was. But the flip side to that, it is bloody brutal. Have you completed? I would actually say that.
Yeah, to be honest, this is good. It's a good point. There's two things. First of all, can you be honest with me? Did you rip it off or did you buy it?
I bought it. Because
if you ripped it off, I put copy protection in it, which basically meant I knew exactly how long the tape would run after it finished, and I could detect when the tape stopped playing. And of course, most people just copied from C6 to the C60.
Yeah.
And if the tape player didn't stop playing within 5 seconds of how long the tape was, I would make the game impossibly hard.
Really?
Yes.
That's interesting. That's
So
interesting.
basically, there was absolutely no way of winning if you ripped it off, because the game would just become impossible. All the monsters would be twice as powerful, and you wouldn't get, So there you go.
Yeah.
But also on top of that, of course, one of the problems you have when you made a game, we test each level individually. And we never tested the whole game from end to end, until right at the end. And then, of course, by that point, we were really good at it.
Yeah.
And what we didn't really have is testers. We didn't have people,
Yeah.
who would start as novices. So the game was really hard. I mean, we should have really done pick up lives, which is something we fixed later on. We should have really had the witch being able to pick up some lives or pick up some energy or something.
I think if I was to sort of try and pick holes in it, I think what I find a really unfair game mechanic is the fact that it's essentially a shoot 'em up. You collect things, but you've got to shoot things. But the fact that you're actually losing health every time you shoot. I mean, I've done quite a few videos playing it. Obviously, it's a ROM, so it's not an original create. So I'm assuming it's probably how would a ROM on an emulator would that know that it was a copied game, given that there's
no,
because
there's a good chance whoever did the conversion ripped out the piece of code. It wasn't like very sophisticated, so they would have probably just disabled that. But the biggest problem we had is we didn't think about giving the player pickups for lives or give pickups for energy, and that would have made a huge difference to the gameplay. And that's because actually, if you play each level individually, it's not that hard. You might lose a life, but if you do 60 levels, you don't have enough lives, right? so we just didn't test it properly. We didn't test it the way we should have tested it.
I think I can imagine. I mean, I'm not a technical person at all, but I mean, when you look at a game nowadays for the PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5, it's I don't know, 60 to 100 gig of data.
Yeah.
Back then, you're talking probably
56K.
Aye, there you go. I mean,
it's actually smaller than the smallest picture on your phone, the whole game.
Aye.
So and we only managed to get 56K onto the Commodore 64 because I wrote a special piece of hardware to allow me to directly download the binary image into the memory, because there wasn't actually enough space for the sort of the shadow ROM to go in there. So it was quite a lot of work, and actually just to compile the code, to basically assemble the code. It's all done in assembly language. Assemble the code took 2 or 3 minutes on what then was a really powerful computer. So it was kind of a bit of a labor of love, really. But yeah, it could have definitely done with more testing. We learned. I'll tell you what, we learned a lot with Cauldron. We learned a lot about what worked and what didn't work. So one of the things we learned is we have to write really good tools. So we actually wrote a lot of tools. There's something like the Commodore 64 is a character set of 256 characters, but to do the graphics you needed 800 characters. So we had a remappable character set. It would automatically remap the character set to give you more graphics, basically, dynamically between levels. So there's a lot of sophisticated stuff going on. It's just, to be honest, at the end of it, that we should have tested it more. And I apologize for those frustrating hours.
I mean, it's honestly, it's one of my. I'm a massive. I've got a big collection of hardware and all that, but I very rarely play it. I would probably go, and people don't like me for saying this. I would say that probably 95% of 8-bit games, you put it on for 5 minutes and think, right, okay, there's not there. But there are certain games that I will play, and Cauldron was one of these games, but I had a love-hate relationship with it because it was just so damn difficult. So you're telling me that the ROM version that I play in my videos is the easier one? I would hate to play the difficult one.
It's quite possible, because the copy protection might have kicked in, right? Which basically it means that it's really brutal, and the idea was to make people suffer if they ripped me off.
That's an absolute ingenious. It's an ingenious copy protection, because people wouldn't. Well, I don't know what would it achieve. It wouldn't stop people copying it, and they probably would have been completely unaware that even existed. That's
there's no internet. Don't forget, it's all done before the internet. There was no way of people, unless they and it wasn't publicized.
Awesome.
I think with every game you make, you learn something new. I mean, one thing we learned with the we showed Cauldron at the LET show in Earl's Court, which is Leisure Electronic Trader was the trade rag for videos and games at that point.
Yeah.
And we did that, and there's a little girl on the stand next to us. It was a trade-only show, but she was with her dad, who ran this video shop. And she kept coming over, and she kept crashing the witch into the mountain. And I said to her, do you want me to show you the Fly the Witch? No, I'm really enjoying myself. And she just kept killing the witch. And there was a group of people, it's like a crowd of people formed around her, watching her do this. And we thought, God, yeah, this is going to be successful. We just loved it. Just just a little spinning thing, it was just, they loved it, and that was just so I think that point, and of course every time you do something you learn something, and we sort of took a lot of that learning to Barbarian, really, where Barbarian actually I think it's got a much better difficulty curve. And then of course we went totally the other way with Antiriad, where we made it far too easy.
So what was your involvement with Barbarian? I was looking at Wikipedia earlier, and you don't seem to get any credits for Barbarian or Antiriad.
I was at that point we'd kind of expanded, so I became sort of the head programmer, head project manager, and we hired a guy called Stan Skembry. He was the lead programmer on Barbarian. So he did all the main game code. I wrote a sprite multiplexer, so I still kept my hand in. But at that point, we were sort of trying to do two games at the same time, so I was kind of overseeing both games. And there was a guy, you probably know Dan Malone, who's one of the best artists in the world. He joined us, and essentially he was assistant art on Barbarian, and then he became lead artist on Antiriad, and we kind of let him run with it. So at that point, we were kind of trying to do two games simultaneously. So I was basically running the team.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things about all the Palace games, graphically wise, they were outstanding. They really, obviously, Evil Dead was quite simplistic. Just kind of going back to Evil Dead. So how did you? Obviously, it's a hack and slash. It's it's a visual film. Quite gory. I mean, I can, as a child, I remember going to the cinema to see. I think it was classed as a video nasty at that point.
It was a video nasty, definitely. I got in trouble. I've been in trouble with Mary Ratters a few times, and that's one of them, actually.
Now you look at it, and it's actually it's more, isn't it? It's comical, but it's brilliant. I mean, I love Bruce Campbell and all these, the whole kind of thing. But what kind of elements of the film did you try and put into the game? Obviously, it's different limbs coming through the doors.
It's the turning of the main thing was that the evil spirit turns the characters into ghouls, right? So basically keep the door shut, keep the evil spirit out, and if you can't, you don't have to basically dismember them. So that kind of was the key game mechanic. So that's kind of what we focused on. It's quite funny. My cousin is a massive comic collector. And he went to Comic-Con in New York, and he bumped into Sam Raimi. He was getting his autograph, and he basically said to Sam Raimi, "Oh, my nephew is the guy who made the Evil Dead game." He said, "Yeah, I've got it on my shelf."
Awesome.
That was quite funny.
Did you get to meet Sam? Did you get to meet Sam Raimi at all?
No. I mean, to be honest, we didn't. I think he must have. We must have sent him a copy because he had a copy. So. It was quite funny.
That's awesome. So did Evil Dead have that sneaky tape difficulty thing built in? Because that was hard as well.
It was hard. And again, one of the challenges you have is that you got to picture the scene. There's basically Evil Dead. It was basically Pete and me.
Yeah.
And we did everything. Pete was literally drawing the graphics on graph paper and then typing the binary code into hexadecimal editor. Mm-hmm. That was our graphics tool. This is before any of the paint programs. Everything was literally manual, like bit manipulation. So it was just massively time consuming. And to be honest, by the end of it, you just wanted to get it finished. But the Evil Dead had his own back on me, because actually I went to deliver the master tape to the replicator, and I got knocked off my motorbike on Euston Road on the way back.
Oh, seriously?
So there you go. I broke my wrist.
The curse of Evil Dead strikes again.
We used that as PI as well. The curse of the Evil Dead strikes the lead programmer. So,
dearie me. What was I going to say? The Evil Dead, according to Wikipedia, again, it was released on the C64, the BBC, and there was also a version of the Spectrum, but the Spectrum didn't get a commercial release, but it was bundled on the back of Cauldron.
The
What was the reason for that?
The Spectrum version was done by a third party, and we were never quite happy with it. So it kind of we didn't want to give it a sort of major commercial release. So the BBC version was also done by a third party. So we kind of had at that point you used to have people converting the software. The biggest problem with the biggest problem is the people who did Spectrum really well. I'm not a Spectrum guy. I was a Commodore 64 guy, and if you probably remember, there was a real sort of us and them situation.
Yeah.
And to make Spectrum games really well, you really had to deal with the attribute clash, because you had 8x8 attributes for the color, and you had pixel accurate bitmaps. And the people who did really well were Ultima. Right,
yeah.
Ultima were the people who totally mastered for. They literally designed games around the attribute problem. And of course, we didn't do that. We weren't Spectrum geeks. So a lot of times we just thought this isn't going to work. So for example, you see the color of the Gould change as they move into another attribute field, and it just looked rubbish. But actually, there was no way around it other than totally redesigning the game. And that's what they did so well. That's why they kind of went with the very simplistic, almost black and white look, which works fantastically for that, that thing, because the Spectrum has twice the horizontal resolution, but the colors were only 8x8. While the Commodore 64, you could have colors, you could have 4 or 16 colors per pixel, but he only had 160 pixels across the screen. So the Spectrum looked really, if you programmed it right, it looked really high res.
Yeah.
Right, but color depleted. Unless you kept the colors within sort of, and that's what Ultima did really well. And I have to say, to this day, we were never really a Spectrum company. We always struggled with it because we didn't. I hate to say it, we didn't love the machine. We didn't love it. We loved the 64 and we loved the Amiga, but we didn't love the Spectrum.
I think that's the thing. I mean, back in the early days, I mean, you talked about Jeff Minter. Jeff was primarily, he was a kind of Atari C64 VIC-20 guy. He never really did many games in the Spectrum. And then Ultimate were kind of more Spectrum. I mean, I always thought that I had a C64, my mate had a Spectrum, and I always used to kind of laugh at him thinking it's like a toy, it looks rubbish. Which 30 years on, I've got a Spectrum and it's a fantastic machine. But Ultimate could really make the Spectrum sing. And then they brought out games in the C64 and I just thought they were rubbish.
But they just because they made the limitations of that machine a virtue, and that's a real skill. That's a real skill. There's loads of things you do on the Commodore 64. Like for example, you could multiplex hardware sprites. I could make massive sprites by using DMA interrupts to change the sprite pointers all the way down the page, and can make these massive sprites like we did in Cauldron. Could never do that on the Spectrum, right? But you then just wouldn't do that sort of game on it, and that was their genius. Their genius was, we were going to make a game that works with the limitations, And I think they were so good at it, and in many ways, we always, I hate to say this, but I think for us, the Spectrum was just always a case of, well, let somebody else do it,
That's the thing. There's certain types of games. I mean, like I love Manic Miner. I think it's a classic game. If I'm going to play Manic Miner, I'll play it on the Spectrum. If you're going to play like a Uridium or Whizball or something, you're going to play the C64 because it's more kind of arcade.
You've got the hardware sprites, and the hardware sprites on the 64 were just they were literally years ahead of their time. I mean, years ahead of their time. I mean, it's amazing power.
Did you ever contemplate like programming for the Atari at all?
Yeah, I did with the Atari ST.
Oh no, the Atari like 800 or 400.
We did, but they were quite expensive.
They were very expensive.
They were quite expensive, and the software market wasn't really. The software market was there in the US, but there was no domestic software market for those. So we did a lot of work on the 64, which there was a big domestic market for, and then later on the Amstrad as well, there was a big domestic market for that. We did then we did some stuff for the Amiga because again there was a big domestic market. So no, but we know the ST was a decent machine, but to be honest, there's a little bit of snobbery in this because the Atari ST was a good compromise, but the Amiga was just an amazing piece of hardware. It was a multitasking operating system, right, with hardware, sprites, and DMA. I mean, and I'm sorry, a bit of a geek, that's just amazing to work with. That's such a lot of fun. And the ST was just basically kind of a bit sort of cheap.
Well, I mean,
snob.
I had the C64 for about 3 years. I mean, I was working, so I didn't have parents that bought me computers. I had to buy my own computer. I bought it on hire purchase, and then I remember seeing a screenshot of it was International Karate, and it was in computer and video games on the Atari ST, and that just blew my mind. I thought I need to get one. So I sold my Commodore 64 for like £100, and I bought an Atari ST on credit. And what was the first game I got? Arkanoid.
That's right, Jeff. My mate Jeff made that.
Oh, really? Yeah. and it was. I mean, graphically wise, it was a big step up. None of this kind of blocky graphics, but my heart sunk when the music kicked in because the SID chip basically pissed all over the Atari sound chip.
This is I mean, I used to hang out with the Atari, the engineers for the Amiga and the whole Commodore crew. There was such a nice bunch of people, and you meet the engineers, and the hardware is just jaw dropping. I mean, the SID chip, and then later on the what's the other the one that followed it, the Amiga one, just amazing bits of hardware, and I think Commodore's biggest issue was they tried to make this, instead of making it a great games machine, they tried to make it a business computer.
Yeah,
and they really shot themselves in the foot because IBM just basically ate their breakfast. But so I was always a Commodore 64 Amiga sort of person. So I didn't do any work for the PC. I found the architecture really weird. I really liked the 68,000 as a chip. It's an elegant chip with lots of registers and data pointers and stuff. So some of it is just I like the elegance. There's a little bit of the, I just like the engineering of those machines.
Yeah, I watched. There's a film, and it's basically about the birth of the Amiga, and it's incredible. You see this bunch of geeks, and they quite literally says, "Right, we've got to take this to a show tomorrow night." And they had this like motherboard, and it had about 20 million boards all sellotaped onto the back of it, and this was like the Amiga. It was literally just put together with all these geeks. It was an incredible thing.
It's amazing, and I used to go drinking with those guys, and they were just the biggest. I mean, there was such a laugh, there was a whole group of them. There used to be an Amiga developers conference, and we used to get absolutely rat-arsed, and then just talking to them in the bar, and really nice bunch of people.
Yeah. So see, Barbarian. I take it were you like involved in the programming or the sort of the design?
I did the sprite multiplexer, and I did because the sprites are all multiplex, so you get
big graphics. Yeah.
So I did that, and I wrote the difficulty system. So I actually wrote the way that it gets harder, which it does actually have a proper difficulty system, unlike the previous games, where the game literally, the game will get better at, well, it appears to get better at fighting you. So yeah, did bits and pieces, but Stan did most of the program. Stan, again, sadly, is dead now. He's been dead for a few years, but he was a really capable programmer.
Yeah, Barbarian was one of these.
The other person we had on is, you mentioned the music. Richard Joseph did the music.
Richard Joseph, yeah, again, sadly gone.
I mean, again, sadly taken from us too soon. But,
yeah.
I mean, working with Richard was literally the biggest amount of fun I've ever had, because a lot of times you meet people who are a bit precious about what to do. Yeah, I wrote all of the sound drivers for Richard, and he was literally putting stuff in because he wanted it to run really, really quick, and wanted to do really interesting things with it. So we had really low-level sound routines. He would just come and basically hard code this all in like data tables, and we'd import it, and it was just a joy to work with. I mean, such a clever, and anything was never too much for him. It's a real joy. And I think that's one thing about the Palace team is we all were really. I think we're quite good at what we did, but also we're mates, and it's just
It's really
fun.
I was talking to John here about 3-4 months ago, And yeah, he was talking about Richard Joseph, and he virtually echoed what you said. I mean, even I don't know if you're familiar with any of the Sensible Software games like Cannon Fodder.
I think we distributed them in the early days, and actually some of the people ended up going to Sensible. Gary went to Sensible.
Right.
Sensible. Yeah.
But yeah, you could tell he liked to laugh, and I think that was a big thing with Sensible Software as well. Is there were a bunch of mates. They had they had a lot of good fun making things, and I think that comes out in the games that are fun.
It does, and to be honest, they're almost like they're almost like kindred spirits to us. You know, we got on really well. And yeah, I think we distributed the first few games. In fact, we did Shoot 'em Up Construction Kit. I did that on the Amiga, so I did the Amiga version of that. So after I left Palace, so I did it as a freelancer. So yeah, and you know, that was the games business. We always used to hang out and go to the pub a lot.
Is that where a lot of the ideas for games came?
Yeah, a lot of ideas came down the pub. Ironically,
in the back of a beer mat, right?
Yeah, no, it was different days. You know, we still went for lunchtime beer, you know, or 2 or 5.
So how did you come about getting Maria Whittaker?
That was Steve Brown actually. It was Steve's idea to use a page 3. Then it was a page 3 model. She was a major page 3 model.
Yeah.
And we had this book called The Ugly Book, which is basically a model book for character models. And we found Wolf, you know, who's the barbarian, which you probably seen behind me on the back with the and then he wanted somebody to be sort of like a sort of Red Sonja character, you know, and he was and he basically phoned up Maria Whittaker's manager, who's her dad, and these were different days, so apologize for the you know, different days. You know, nowadays this wouldn't be okay, but you know, we kind of thought, you know, at that point, you know, sex sells, so we got to put something sexy on the front cover, and he wanted to do the poster and stuff like that. And he actually phoned her dad, and her dad was like, "What do you want to do?" I said, "Well, I just wanted for a cover shoot and like posters." And she can not take her top off, and her dad was like, "What do you mean? You don't want her to get her tits out?" Okay, no, this is an actual conversation. We're going, no. Said, "Oh, I don't know about that. I don't know about that. You know, I don't know." And he thought it was some really dodgy thing because we didn't want her to get undressed. So like going, no, it's okay. She can be, you know, bikini is okay. You know. And he's going, "Oh, I'm not so sure about it." Then we talked him into it, and they did the photo shoot. And of course, the male model turned out to be he ended up being a gladiator. So that got him the gladiator job.
Oh, really?
Being on the front cover of Barbarian. So
that's what I mean.
And we had to do a special box for Boots because Boots wouldn't stock the poster. So we had to do a box without the poster for Boots. And then of course Mary White has to go again, which drove our sales up. And then we got banned in Germany. We got banned in Germany because it was too violent because of the head chopping. And then we got unbanned because the lawyers who banned us couldn't play it well enough in front of a judge to chop the head off. So the judge couldn't actually, because the judge had to look at the blood squirting to judge it. So we basically then got unbanned. And then we, of course, did a big PR campaign saying, buy it before it gets banned again. And then eventually, here's the irony. So they got one of the children of one of the lawyers to play the game in front of the judge to show them how to do it. And then we got banned. And of course, by that point, we had a version ready with green blood. So we got unbanned again. So
utterly ridiculous, you know, it really is. But I mean,
it's just funny. But I mean, we goes like, you know, gratuitous violence and that the video nasties were really in and stuff. And
I mean, you look at, I don't know if you've ever seen like any of like Mortal Kombat 11. It's
brutal,
so graphic.
Yeah,
but
it's really, they're ripping a spine out there. It's just brutal. I mean, we were quite tame, but at the time, this was a big deal. The other thing we did with that game, we did our first few bits of localization, and we started out with Cauldron. We did a lot with Barbarian, and it made such a big difference with the international market. You know, I think my sister did the translation, and then all these shops in Germany had never seen a game in German before. So they were saying, wow, this is a game in German. So we can actually, you know, we can promote this. And so we did lots of sales just because it was localized. And again, it's another lesson we learned, localize, you know. So but it was that was a learning curve. I think Barbarian was really I really enjoyed Barbarian, and that was one of the ones where I think we got most things right.
Yeah, I think did that not? I'm sure the C64 did it not come in quite a big kind of plastic case. I'm sure it was.
I think it was a bigger box because we had to
Kind of
post
black.
it.
It was kind of black plastic. I'm sure it was.
It was
I'm
a
sure
nice
it was,
box. It was, and we, it was it was all. At that point, we kind of got good at it. We kind of we tested better, we marketed better, we had fewer bugs. It kind of really came together with Barbarian.
I think I've got to say the C64 version is the best one, even over. I mean, when I got my ST, I got Barbarian and I got it on Amiga, and yeah, you had the sort of like the real sound effects of the kind of sword on swords. But I just think the playability of the C64 one was just
the problem is those sprites are really big. I mean, they don't look big now, but they were really big. And you're running on a machine that's got that was basically running like at 750 kilohertz. That was the clock time, right? On the 64, and on the ST, I think it wasn't a lot faster. I think it's a megahertz or something. So it wasn't a huge amount of. So there really wasn't a lot of time to process all that stuff, So I always felt that although the 64 games looked a bit chunkier, they were slick. They were really quick.
Yeah.
I mean, look at some of the sensible games. I mean, like Chaos Machine and stuff. That's so quick. That's because it got hardware sprites. Right. So, but yeah, you're right. I mean, the ST had no video assist. There's no assistance. You had to write everything with the CPU. There was no co-processor for the graphics. And that was the processor was quite slow. I mean, those days it was fast, but it was quite slow, really.
Yeah, I mean they were all good versions, but I always preferred the C64 one. Yeah. What about the sequel to Barbarian? I'll be honest, I wasn't a fan of Barbarian 2.
Yeah, I'd left Palace by then. I left.
So nothing to do with you. So we can say it was shit. Yeah, well, I wouldn't say it was shit, but it was disappointing. I bought it, and I just.
Do you know the weird thing is, and actually, one of the reasons, I sort of saw console coming, and Steve and me did actually, and we saw what's happening with Nintendo, and we realized that these consoles will be huge. And Palace wasn't prepared to invest in consoles, so we thought, we don't really want to go there. And of course, then the problem is the company gets bigger and bigger. And what used to be like Steve and me going down the pub and going, we're going to do this, suddenly, like everything was done by committee. And I think what you got with Barbarian 2 is essentially a committee design. It wasn't like a. I'll be honest. For the most part, I wasn't a visionary. I was kind of the tech person. But Steve and I worked really well together, and I think it was kind of when it became more of a sort of like everyone had to have design input and stuff like that. You lose a lot of that spontaneity and that single vision, and you end up with too many cooks.
Yeah, I was just going to say
that was definitely a too many cooks product.
Aye, it's almost a bit like I mean, one of my favourite games was Way of the Exploding Fist. I think it's just like even now it's an awesome game, and then the sequel came out and that was shit as well. They kind of overthought it and like let's put a kind of backstory.
At that point, they wanted to have an adventure game and they wanted a fighting game, and it's got to be fighting and adventure. And the reality is the hardware hasn't got any bigger. So it ends up being this kind of. It just ends up. I get all of the desires to want to do this, but it is. You do end up with. I mean, I sort of one of the obviously I had a career after Palace as well. I suddenly realized that a lot of times when something gets really complicated, you actually have to make the team smaller. A lot of people they put more resources onto something. Say something is not working well. They expand the team, and I think that's a deadly mistake. Actually, when something isn't going well, you should cut the resources down and get it back to a core.
Yeah,
and I think that's. I think in some ways that's. It wasn't the reason I left Palace, but it certainly didn't have the same feeling anymore. It didn't feel the same way, and things were just more complicated than used to be. And that's why I kind of left. I'm still very good friends with them, but I did freelance work for them. I just didn't want to run it.
I suppose when you're a small team, maybe it's just you and somebody else, you can see it all how each bit fits together. But when you've got somebody doing the graphics, somebody doing the sound, somebody doing level, all the bits are put together and nobody actually stands back and goes, do these actually work? And that's why you get some games that are just completely broken.
And you know, here's the rub. I was paid $5,000 a year for making $5,000 a year was my annual salary, right? So really, we were probably, you know, even then that was really crap money.
That was, yeah.
And you know, so we worked, you know, $30,000 would go a long way. You know, then very quickly $30,000 became our monthly payroll, and then became a weekly payroll. You know, and suddenly suddenly there are consequences for not shipping on time. You know, the real consequences. And that's also, you know, and a lot of times you kind of go, you know, in many ways you want a big company, but you really, a lot of times you don't, especially when you're starting off, you know, a new concept. You really want very few people. And at that point, there really wasn't a contracting market. It was everyone was employed, right? So I think that you know, so then you get to the point where you suddenly say you have a marketing team, right? What do they do between games?
Yeah.
It's like, what do they do? You've got nothing for them to do. So they keep hassling you for screenshots. So you're now making screenshots, right, rather than working on the game. And there's this thing where you sort of half, you know, and some companies, they've just plowed through that period and became really big. You know, Ultima did, and you know, various other companies did, like Cody's and companies did.
Yeah.
But you know, Palace never really had the investment to get really big, you know, and publish out, because what we really had to do is publish other people's games to get us through the bits when we didn't have any games. And we never we didn't have the money to pick up the really good games. So kind of that whole third-party thing, and a lot of companies made a lot of money doing that, and that meant when they kept the marketing team busy all the time.
Yeah, I know. I've spoke to a few guys. A few guys like the guys with task tech software and that kind of stuff, and there was a lot of really successful 8-bit companies, but they were too small, and then when things got bigger and there was bigger budgets, they weren't able to really adapt. And
then of course when the American, I was just looking at the clock. I've got a few more minutes, but when the American market opened up, it was all PC. It was PC, right? And we had no PC experience over here. And it was all, then it was a big change from assembly language to C, basically. And there weren't very many C programmers here. So a lot of times we had products, but we didn't have the right products for the American market. And of course, that's also the time when console came out and people were doing stuff for Nintendo NES and stuff. And you know, we didn't have the budgets to do this. So it kind of, that's where you sort of started seeing the American dominance, really. Because think about America. I mean, America, one of the biggest things about America is its domestic market is massive. Its domestic market is bigger than Europe, right? And for the domestic market, you just put a game out in English. You don't have to worry about borders and, you know, and different laws. You just put it out in one language. So if you have a hit in America, just because the domestic market is so big, your hit is so much bigger, right? This is how companies like EA and Activision came to be, because they had a massive domestic market.
Yeah.
And yeah, we always like, we're kind of a relatively small island, you know, with, you know, maybe, you know, our domestic market is maybe what, 50 to 150,000 units or something.
Great stuff. Listen, Richard, what we'll do if well, I know you're on a tight time frame, we'll wrap this one up. Would you be up for a second part? Because we've kind of fantastic, because I think we've kind of got to the end of the 8-bits, and I've still got loads of questions. So fantastic. Listen, Richard, thank you very much for joining me, and I look forward to catching. I'll be in touch, and we'll get together again maybe next week, whatever, and we can crack on with part 2.
Sounds good. All right. Take care.
Cheers, Richard. Take care, buddy. See you, buddy. Bye.